On the freezing morning of Tuesday, the 12th of November, 1986, in the rolling hills just outside of Mount Vernon, Knox County, Ohio, a 32-year-old structural engineer named Arthur Penhaligon stood on a gravel driveway and definitively condemned a building. The structure in question was a massive, 3-story timber frame bank barn sitting on a foreclosed 200-acre farm. Inside that barn, resting quietly on the suspended second-floor loft, was a fully intact 1,912 case 40 horsepower steam traction engine weighing exactly 14 tons. Arthur held a clipboard carrying a $12,000 demolition estimate and a county safety injunction. He had a degree from a prestigious university, a firm in Columbus that trusted his math and absolute certainty in his voice. Standing next to him in the freezing mud was Silas Vance. Silas was 80 years old. He wore a faded canvas coat, he had an 8th grade education, and he had built the barn with his own hands 50 years earlier. The county had ordered the massive steam engine removed so the barn could be safely dismantled for architectural salvage. But Arthur had just informed the heavy rigging crew that moving the machine was a physical impossibility. According to his calculations, the aging wooden floor joists holding the engine were operating at 200% of their maximum shear capacity. Arthur declared that the moment the rigging crew attempted to roll the 14-ton machine toward the loft doors, the dynamic load shift would shatter the central carrying beam. The entire second floor would instantly collapse, taking the machine, the barn, and the crew down into the stone foundation below. He wasn't guessing. He had the span tables to prove it. The men on the heavy rigging crew nodded silently. They were seasoned professionals who respected gravity, and they deeply respected the math of a licensed structural engineer. They began packing up their heavy log chains and hydraulic winches. The only safe way to extract the steam engine, Arthur concluded, was to bring in a specialized crew to carefully dismantle the 80-year-old barn piece by piece from the roof down, leaving the engine exposed to be lifted by a massive commercial crane. It would cost the bank an additional $18,000, but it was the only option that didn't end in a fatal collapse. That was when Silas Vance stepped forward. He walked slowly past the architect, put his bare, calloused hand flat against the weathered white oak siding of the barn, and told the rigging foreman to hook up his cables. Arthur warned him that he was signing a death warrant for anyone who stepped inside. Silas looked at the young man, looked at the clipboard, and quietly replied that the barn wouldn't drop a quarter of an inch. If you have ever witnessed the silent, stubborn resistance of wood hewn by a master's hands against the precise calculations of an engineer on paper, or if you were the one standing on that gravel driveway, this story is for you. Walton's Iron is where these records are kept. Subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes true engineering isn't found on a computer screen. It is hidden in the curve of an 80-year-old oak beam. Now let me tell you what Silas Vance actually knew. There was a profound gap in knowledge standing in that driveway. Arthur Penhaligon understood modern materials. He understood milled, dimensioned lumber purchased from a supplier, which behaves in a predictable, linear fashion under stress. But Silas Vance didn't build with modern materials. In the brutal winter of 1936, when Silas was 30 years old, he and his father walked into the deepest part of their Ohio woods and felled 12 specific, mature white oak trees. They didn't haul them to a sawmill to be sliced into perfect straight rectangles. They hand-hewed them in the freezing snow using broadaxes. Silas hadn't just cut the wood. He had studied the natural upward sweep of the tree trunks. When he hewed the massive 16-inch thick central carrying beam that would support the barn's second floor, he deliberately left that natural curve intact, a traditional timber framing structural concept known as camber. When Silas set that massive beam into the heavy stone foundation of the barn, he placed it with the curve facing up, like a giant drawn bow waiting for an arrow. He didn't build the barn to simply hold dead weight passively. He built it to actively fight back against gravity. The young architect, looking at the floorboards, saw wood that was sagging under an impossible load. What exactly was the math that an 80-year-old man had done with an axe 50 years prior? In the fall of 1948, when Silas finally retired his massive 1,912 case steam engine from the fields, he drove it slowly up the earthen bank and into the upper loft of the barn. As the 14 tons of solid iron rolled to a stop directly over the center span, the sheer, crushing weight of the machine pushed the upward curve of that cambered oak beam down until it was perfectly flat. But the wood didn't yield. It loaded. For the next 38 years, the massive central beam acted like a tightly coiled suspension spring, actively pushing 28,000 pounds of upward force back into the iron. The sagging floorboards that Arthur Penhaligon had meticulously measured weren't structural components at all. They were just thin pine decking molding and bowing around the engine's massive iron wheels. The deep bones of the barn, the hand-hewn white oak carrying beam, and the massive mortise and tenon joints were locked in a perfect, invisible state of kinetic tension. But Arthur didn't know that. He had never been taught to calculate the stored kinetic energy of a hand-hewn timber frame. He only knew what the modern textbooks told him, and the textbooks told him that any flat beam holding that much weight for that long was a ghost waiting to fall. The rigging foreman, caught between an educated engineer and an old man, finally signaled the crane operator to take up the slack on the winch. What happens when a spring that has been compressed for nearly 4 decades is suddenly released? The heavy steel winch cable snapped taut, vibrating violently in the freezing November air with the immense tension of a 28,000-pound dead load. At the edge of the gravel driveway, the commercial extraction crane dug its hydraulic outriggers deeper into the frozen Ohio mud, its massive diesel engine bellowing a steady, rhythmic roar as the operator engaged the primary gear. Inside the dark, cavernous loft of the 80-year-old bank barn, the 1,912 case steam traction engine had not moved a single fraction of an inch since the Truman administration. Its massive, 5-foot-tall rear iron wheels, studded with thick traction cleats, had effectively bonded with the white pine decking over the decades. Arthur Penhaligon took 3 deliberate steps backward, distancing himself from the structure. He instinctively raised his metal clipboard over his chest, bracing for the deafening, explosive crack of shattering white oak. According to the absolute laws of modern structural physics, the dynamic force required to break the engine's static friction would instantly overload the central carrying beam. The moment the iron shifted, the beam would snap, the floor would buckle, and 14 tons of antique machinery would plunge violently into the stone foundation below. Standing just 20 feet away, Silas Vance did not step backward. He did not brace himself. He simply folded his arms across his faded canvas coat, his breath rising in small, calm white clouds in the cold air, and watched the heavy steel cable pull tight against the iron hitch. The crane roared louder. The massive rear wheels of the steam engine groaned, shifting forward exactly 1 inch. As the 14 tons of solid iron rolled slowly off the dead center point of the loft, Arthur Penhaligon shut his eyes. He waited for the deafening, apocalyptic roar of a catastrophic structural failure. He waited for the massive oak beam to splinter and the roof to cave in. But the roar never came. Instead, something entirely counterintuitive happened, something that defied every modern calculation written on his clipboard. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the dark interior of the barn's lower level. It was not the sharp, violent sound of wood breaking. It was the slow, immense sound of wood relaxing. As the crushing weight of the steam engine moved toward the heavy exterior doors, the hand-hewn white oak carrying beam, freed from a half-century of continuous, extreme pressure, began to rapidly release its stored kinetic energy. The camber, the natural upward curve that Silas Vance had carefully preserved with his broadaxe in 1936, began to forcefully assert itself. The barn floor did not collapse downward under the dynamic shift. Incredibly, it began to bow slightly upward. The massive wooden mortise and tenon joints, perfectly pinned with dry hickory pegs, absorbed the moving weight flawlessly. They did exactly what they had been cut to do 50 years prior. They transferred the dynamic load outward, pushing the kinetic energy away from the center span and driving it safely down into the immense stone pillars of the foundation. The young architect opened his eyes in time to see the giant iron wheels of the 1,912 case steam engine cross the threshold of the loft doors and roll smoothly onto the heavy steel extraction ramps. The barn hadn't just survived the load shift, it had actively repelled it. It took exactly 14 minutes for the heavy rigging crew to secure the 14-ton steam engine onto the waiting lowboy trailer. When the roar of the massive extraction crane finally cut off, a profound, heavy silence fell over the Knox County farm. The bank barn stood perfectly intact, its roofline as straight and true as it had been on the day it was framed. Silas Vance walked slowly out of the dark, cavernous lower level and stepped into the harsh, flat November sunlight. He patted the heavy stone foundation once, quietly, and walked over to his rusted pickup truck to retrieve a battered thermos of hot coffee. He didn't gloat. He didn't march over to the young architect to demand an apology or boast about his triumph. Silas knew that the architect's math wasn't exactly wrong. It simply applied to a different reality. If Silas had built that barn using fast-growth pine from a commercial lumber yard, or if he had let the slate roof leak and allow rot to compromise the mortise joints over the decades, Arthur's calculations would have been flawlessly, fatally accurate. The barn would have collapsed the moment the winch went taut. The old man's victory was not a magical suspension of physics. It was the result of a highly specific, painstakingly executed method of old-growth timber framing that demanded perfectly cured wood, precise axe work, and decades of relentless maintenance. The old way didn't work just because it was old. It worked because of the unforgiving standard to which it was originally built. Arthur Penhaligon stood frozen by his truck for a long time. He looked up at the empty loft doors. He looked at the perfectly intact roofline. He looked down at the $12,000 demolition estimate and the pages of highly educated, perfectly executed, utterly useless calculations attached to his clipboard. He didn't get into his truck and drive away in shame. Instead, he walked slowly across the gravel yard until he was standing face to face with the old builder. Arthur didn't apologize, and he didn't offer a dramatic confession of his own arrogance. He was a man who respected the absolute laws of physics, and he had just watched physics behave in a way that defied everything he had been taught in a university lecture hall. He looked at Silas, his voice quiet, stripped of all its previous administrative certainty, and asked a single, genuine question. How did it hold? Silas poured a cup of black coffee from the battered thermos, handed it to the young architect without a word of reproach, and looked back at the massive timber structure he had raised when he was barely a man. Your math was right, son, Silas said quietly, steam rising from his own cup in the cold air. You calculated exactly what it takes to break a dead piece of lumber. But you didn't calculate what it takes to break a tree. That white oak beam spent 200 years holding up 10 tons of its own branches in the wind before I ever put an axe to it. I didn't make it strong. I just let it keep doing its job. The most reliable advantage a person can carry into a room full of experts is not a prestigious degree, and it is rarely the loudest voice. It is the quiet, earned understanding of the material standing right in front of you. The world is full of modern formulas designed to calculate the breaking point of old things, written by men who never learned how those things were built in the first place. True strength is rarely calculated on a drafting table. It is grown in the deep woods, it is cut by hand, and it is tested by time. The massive bank barn in Knox County still stands today, completely unbothered by the winter winds, holding nothing but empty space and the quiet memory of the old man who knew exactly what it could bear. Every story doesn't make the record. It does here.